Pam Bondi walked onto the stage with confidence, her presence commanding attention as she took her seat across from the talk show host. The tension in the air was palpable even before the conversation began. From the moment she arrived, it was clear that the host had no intention of giving her a fair and balanced discussion. Instead, the questions came sharp and loaded, laced with condescension and an unmistakable bias. The audience watched as the host interrupted her mid-sentence, dismissing her points with a smug smile. But Pam Bondi was not one to back down easily. With a steady voice and unwavering poise, she calmly responded to each attack, refusing to be rattled. Every attempt to corner her was met with a well-articulated and powerful rebuttal. The crowd, expecting a heated exchange, was instead left in stunned silence as she dismantled the host's arguments with grace and undeniable logic. As the interview went on, the host's frustration became evident. Their jabs grew more aggressive, their attempts to twist her words more desperate. But Bondi remained unshaken, her confidence growing with each exchange. She didn't need to raise her voice or resort to insults. Her sharp intellect did all the work. Then came the moment that no one saw coming. After another condescending remark from the host, Bondi leaned forward slightly, her expression calm yet firm, and delivered a response so cutting yet dignified that the audience gasped. For a moment, there was silence. Even the host, known for dominating conversations, seemed momentarily at a loss for words. The audience, initially leaning in favor of the host, now shifted in their seats, murmuring among themselves. Then, a slow but steady wave of applause began. It was clear that Bondi had not only held her own, but had completely turned the tables as the segment wrapped up. The host, visibly uncomfortable, tried to regain control of the narrative, but the damage was done. Pam Bondi had made her point, and she had done so with intelligence, composure, and an undeniable sense of authority. As she walked off stage, the energy in the room had changed. The audience, once expecting to see her falter, had instead witnessed a masterclass in handling adversity with grace. As Pam Bondi walked backstage, the energy of the confrontation still lingered in the air. Producers and staff members exchanged hushed words, some glancing at the host, who was now clearly rattled. The talk show, known for its fiery debates and often one-sided narratives, had just witnessed something unexpected. A guest who didn't just survive the heat but owned the entire exchange. Moments later, as Bondi gathered her things, a staffer approached her with a hesitant but impressed smile. "That was incredible," they said quietly. "You really turned that around." Bondi simply nodded, offering a polite but knowing smile. She had done this before, handled hostile interviews, faced relentless critics, but something about this one felt different. Perhaps it was the audience's reaction, the way their perception had visibly shifted throughout the interview. Meanwhile, back on stage, the host struggled to regain composure as they moved on to the next segment. Their usual air of authority had been cracked, and the audience's reaction had made it clear that Bondi had left an impression far deeper than they had anticipated. As she exited the studio, her phone buzzed with messages, friends, colleagues, and even political opponents acknowledging the moment. Clips of the exchange were already circulating online, with some calling it a masterclass in handling media bias, and others praising her for standing her ground without resorting to theatrics. By the time she reached her car, news outlets had begun picking up the story. Social media was flooded with reactions, many from people who hadn't expected to be impressed by her, but now found themselves rethinking their stance. The debate raged on in comment sections and video threads, but one thing was certain: Pam Bondi had walked into a hostile environment and left with the upper hand. And as she drove away, she did so knowing that the conversation wasn't over. It was just getting started. As Pam Bondi drove through the city streets, her phone continued buzzing with notifications. She glanced at a few messages at a red light. Texts from allies congratulating her, journalists requesting interviews, and even a few unexpected names, commending her for how she handled the situation. By the time she reached her destination, a quiet cafe where she planned to unwind for a moment, her name was already trending on social media. Clips of the interview had been edited and shared across platforms with captions like, Pam Bondi shuts down host with facts, and talk show host gets schooled on live TV. Some called her a hero, while others, particularly supporters of the host, accused her of being too assertive. She ordered a coffee and took a seat near the window, watching as debates unfolded online. News outlets had already picked up the story, with some highlighting her composure and others attempting to spin the event in favor of the host. But the audience reaction was undeniable. She had made an impact. A familiar voice broke her focus. "Quite the interview, huh?" She looked up to see an old colleague, a former prosecutor, standing there with a smirk. He slid into the seat across from her. "You really rattled them." Pam chuckled. "I didn't set out to rattle anyone, I just wasn't going to let them twist my words." Her friend nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "Well, you did more than that. You controlled the conversation. People noticed. Some aren't too happy about it." He tilted his phone toward her, showing a fresh round of headlines. Some were praising her strength, while others painted her as too aggressive or dismissive. Pam sighed, setting her cup down. That's how it always goes. The truth makes people uncomfortable. Just then, a young woman approached their table cautiously. "Excuse me, Ms. Bondi?" Pam looked up with a warm smile. "Yes?" The woman hesitated before speaking. "I just wanted to say, I wasn't always a fan. I used to believe what people said about you. But after watching that interview, I saw how unfairly you were treated and how you handled it. It changed how I see things. So, thank you." Pam was taken aback for a moment before nodding. "Thank you for saying that. I appreciate it." The woman smiled, then walked away, leaving Pam and her friend in a moment of thoughtful silence. Her friend grinned. "Looks like you're winning hearts and minds." Pam took another sip of her coffee, her expression calm but resolute. One conversation at a time. As Pam Bondi sat back in her chair, she reflected on the young woman's words. It wasn't often that people admitted to changing their minds, especially in today's polarized world, but that brief encounter reminded her why she did what she did. Not to argue for the sake of arguing, but to stand firm in her beliefs and present the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it made others. Her friend leaned in, lowering his voice. "You know this isn't over, right? The host's team is already doing damage control. Some outlets are calling you combative and too aggressive." He rolled his eyes. "Typical spin." Pam chuckled, unfazed. "Let them spin it. The audience saw what happened. They know the truth." Just then, her phone buzzed again, this time a call from a well-known news network. She sighed, knowing what was coming. "Here we go," she muttered before answering. "Pam, hi. We'd love to have you on tonight to discuss your interview from earlier," the producer said enthusiastically. "It's going viral and people can't stop talking about your response. Would you be open to coming on for a segment?" Pam glanced at her friend, who smirked knowingly. "Sure," she said smoothly. "But let's make one thing clear. I'm not coming on to defend myself. I'm coming to set the record straight." The producer hesitated for a moment, then responded, "Understood. We'll send the details shortly." After ending the call, her friend laughed. "You're not giving them an inch, are you?" Pam smiled. "Why should I? I've spent too much time letting people twist narratives. If they want to talk about what happened, I'll be there, but on my terms." As the sun set outside the cafe window, Pam knew that this was just the beginning. The media storm would rage on, opinions would fly from both sides, and attempts to discredit her would continue. But she had been through this before, and she wasn't about to back down. With renewed determination, she picked up her phone and sent a simple tweet. The truth speaks for itself. Always has. Always will. Within minutes, the tweet was already gaining traction. She smiled, finished her coffee, and prepared for the next round. As Pam Bondi left the cafe, the cool evening air felt refreshing against her skin. She could already sense the storm brewing online, but she had no intention of letting it shake her. The night was young, and she had another battle to face. This time on her own terms. By the time she arrived home, the media frenzy had intensified. News commentators dissected her talk show appearance, some praising her for standing firm, others labeling her as unapologetically combative. Social media was ablaze with debates, and hashtags like Pam Bondi owns the host and Pam V's the media were trending. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an old friend from law school, someone who had always followed her career closely. "You really shook things up today," he said with a chuckle. "That host wasn't expecting you to fight back, and now they're scrambling." Pam smiled. "They never do. They expect people like me to play defense, to backpedal. But I know my facts, and I won't let them rewrite the truth." Her friend's voice grew serious. "Be ready for the backlash. The media doesn't like it when someone exposes their bias on their own platform." Pam exhaled, already aware of what was coming. "I've handled worse," she said simply. Later that evening, she prepared for her upcoming news interview. She knew this was an opportunity to not only clarify what had happened, but to remind people why standing firm in your beliefs mattered. As she reviewed her notes, a text from a trusted colleague popped up on her screen. "They're going to try to frame you as hostile. Stick to your message. Facts over emotion. You've got this." Pam smirked. She wasn't worried. The facts were on her side. As the time for her interview approached, she adjusted her blazer, took one last glance in the mirror, and walked confidently toward the camera setup in her home office. The producer's voice came through her earpiece. "We're live in 30 seconds. Ready?" Pam nodded. "Let's do this." The countdown began. 2, 1. The anchor's face appeared on the screen. "Tonight, we're joined by former Florida attorney, General Pam Bondi, who recently made headlines for her fiery exchange with a talk show host. Pam, welcome." She met the camera with a composed expression. "Thank you for having me." And just like that, round 2 had begun. The anchor wasted no time. "Pam, your interview earlier today has sparked quite the debate. Some say you stood your ground, while others claim you were overly aggressive. How do you respond to that?" Pam Bondi tilted her head slightly, her expression calm but firm. "I find it interesting that when a conservative woman speaks with confidence, she's labeled aggressive, but when others do it, they're called strong or empowered. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult anyone. I simply refused to let the host twist my words." The anchor shifted in his seat, clearly not expecting her direct response. "Well, some critics say that your tone was confrontational. Do you think you could have handled it differently?" Pam didn't hesitate. "Handled it differently?" The host interrupted me multiple times, spoke to me condescendingly, and tried to put words in my mouth. I wasn't there to be steamrolled. I was there to have a real conversation. If standing my ground makes people uncomfortable, that says more about them than it does about me. A moment of silence filled the air. The anchor blinked before clearing his throat. "Let's talk about the bigger picture. Do you think this moment represents a larger issue in media today?" Pam nodded. "Absolutely. We see it time and time again. Certain voices are treated with immediate hostility, while others are given a free pass. People are waking up to the bias, and that's why interviews like mine resonate with so many. The media may try to spin the narrative, but the American people see the truth." The anchor tried to pivot. "But surely, you understand why some might view your comments as divisive." Pam let out a small chuckle, shaking her head. "Standing up for yourself isn't divisive. Challenging bias isn't divisive. What's divisive is a media that treats conservatives as adversaries instead of participants in an honest discussion." At that moment, the live chat on the network's broadcast was flooding with comments. Many were praising her, while others, clearly agitated, were calling for the network to cut the interview short. The anchor, realizing he was losing control of the conversation, attempted one last redirect. "Pam, final question. Do you regret anything about today's exchange?" She smiled. "Not at all. If anything, I'm glad it happened, because once again the media tried to push a narrative, and once again the truth spoke louder." The anchor, clearly eager to wrap up, forced a smile. Well, Pam Bondi, thank you for your time tonight. She nodded. My pleasure. As the segment ended, Pam leaned back in her chair, exhaling as she removed her earpiece. Almost immediately, her phone lit up again. Texts, missed calls, notifications flooding in from supporters and critics alike. She turned to her assistant, who had been watching from the other side of the room. How bad is it? She asked with a smirk. Her assistant grinned. Oh, they're mad, but your supporters, they're loving every second of it. Pam laughed, shaking her head. Good. Because this conversation isn't going away anytime soon, and she was right. Within the next hour, headlines exploded across news sites, Twitter was ablaze with fresh debates, and clips from the interview were already being dissected and analyzed. Some called her fearless, others called her controversial. But one thing was certain. Pam Bondi had once again proven that she wasn't one to be silenced, and she had no plans of stopping anytime soon. As the night stretched on, Pam Bondi scrolled through the flood of reactions online. News articles dissected her appearance, pundits on both sides of the aisle debated her words, and social media was in an all-out frenzy. Some called her a role model for standing up to media bias, while others labeled her a firebrand conservative unwilling to play nice. She smirked at the headlines. Play nice? That was the media's way of saying they preferred conservatives who sat back and took the hits without fighting back. But that was never going to be her style. A call from an unknown number interrupted her thoughts. She hesitated for a second before answering. Pam, it's Senator Whitmore, came the voice on the other end. A well-known figure in conservative politics, he was someone who rarely reached out unless something big was happening. Senator, she greeted, sitting up. To what do I owe the call? A chuckle came through the line. You're making waves, that's for sure. I just got off a call with some donors and political strategists. They're impressed. They think you should use this momentum. Pam raised an eyebrow. Use it for what exactly? A pause. Then, how do you feel about running for office? Pam exhaled slowly, staring out the window. She had spent years, in the public eye, fighting legal battles, standing up for her beliefs, and pushing back against the media. But stepping into the political arena in a different capacity, that was a whole new level. Look, the senator continued, sensing her hesitation. You've got what most politicians don't: authenticity. People see you as someone who doesn't back down. That's rare, and it's exactly what we need, right now. Pam drummed her fingers on the table, thinking. She had spent her career fighting for justice, defending the rule of law, and refusing to let media narratives define her. Maybe it was time to take that fight to an even bigger stage. I appreciate the call, Senator, she said finally. Let me think about it. Take your time, he replied. But just know people are watching, and they like what they see. As the call ended, Pam leaned back in her chair, deep in thought. Outside, the city lights flickered, and the noise of the media storm continued. She had never shied away from a challenge before. Maybe this was the next one. Maybe the fight was only just beginning. Pam Bondi set her phone down and let out a slow breath. Running for office? It wasn't the first time someone had suggested it, but this time it felt different. The momentum was real. The firestorm surrounding her interview had ignited something. Beyond just another media controversy, it had turned her into a political force overnight. As she mulled over the idea, another text came in. This time, from an old mentor. The establishment fears strong voices. If you're thinking about stepping in, do it on your terms. Call me. She smirked. Everyone seemed to have an opinion on what she should do next. But Pam had never been the type to make decisions based on outside pressure. If she ran, it would be because she believed it was the right move, not because donors, strategists, or political insiders wanted her to. Just then, her assistant poked her head into the room. Pam, you're not going to believe this. Pam raised an eyebrow. Try me. Her assistant handed over a tablet. On the screen was a breaking news segment. The same talk show host who had tried to corner her earlier was now backtracking, claiming the interview had been misrepresented by social media. Pam let out a short laugh. Oh, now they want to play the victim? Her assistant nodded. It gets better. Some high-profile names are calling for the network to apologize to you for how you were treated. Pam scrolled through the headlines, shaking her head in amusement. This was how the media game worked. When they lost control of the narrative, they tried to rewrite history. Well, Pam said, standing up and stretching. I guess that means I won this round. Her assistant smirked. More like you dominated. Pam glanced at her phone one more time. The calls, the messages, the invitations to speak, the whispers of a political run. It was all swirling around her like a tidal wave. She had a choice to make. She could step back, let the media storm die down, and move on. Or she could lean in, take control of the momentum, and step onto a bigger battlefield. Pam Bondi wasn't one to back down, and as she looked out at the city skyline, she realized something. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next morning, Pam Bondi woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly. She grabbed it from the nightstand and saw an influx of messages, missed calls and emails, some from familiar names in politics, others from media figures who suddenly wanted to clarify their coverage of her interview. She scrolled through the messages, noting how quickly the tide had shifted. A few days ago, she had simply been a guest on a talk show, another conservative voice invited to be challenged. Now she was at the center of a national conversation. A call came through from an unknown number. After a moment's hesitation, she answered. Pam, this is Jeff Caldwell from the RNC. She raised an eyebrow. The Republican National Committee? That was new. Good morning, Jeff. To what do I owe the call? We've been watching how you handled yourself, he said smoothly. You're exactly what the party needs right now, someone who can go toe-to-toe with the media and not flinch. Pam leaned back in her chair, letting him talk. The energy around you is undeniable, Jeff continued. We're wondering, have you ever considered running for Senate? Florida's got a seat coming up and, well, you've got a lot of people in high places talking. Pam smirked. So this was where things were headed. It's funny, she said. You're not the first person to ask me that in the last 24 hours. Jeff chuckled. I'd imagine not. Look, I won't take too much of your time, but if you're open to discussing it, we'd love to sit down with you. The party's looking for fighters, and you've proven you can hold your own. Pam tapped her fingers against the desk, considering. The thought of stepping into an official political role had crossed her mind before, but she had always brushed it aside. Now the question wasn't just hypothetical, the door was wide open. I appreciate the call, Jeff, she said finally. I'll think about it. Of course, we'll be in touch, he said before ending the call. Pam set the phone down and stared at the screen, deep in thought. The idea of running for office wasn't something to take lightly. She had spent her career as a prosecutor and later as attorney general, always in the trenches fighting for what she believed in. But politics was a different battlefield. Just then, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Her assistant stepped in, holding up another tablet. Pam, you've got to see this. She took the tablet and saw a new poll making the rounds, online, one that had been conducted in the wake of her explosive interview. Should Pam Bondi run for Senate? 68% say yes. Pam let out a slow breath. Maybe this wasn't just media hype. Maybe people were genuinely ready for a fighter, and maybe, just maybe, she was ready to be that fighter.